Okay, let's look at some more Bregman stuff. Rutger Bregman on Elites, Survival of the Friendliest, Rethinking Human History, May 22, 2020. The last thing was 2017.
To change the world, you might well have noticed that we have been effectively off the airways for the last few weeks since the coronavirus crisis hit, and we couldn't work out how we could do the podcast if we couldn't do interviews face to face because we became really obsessed by sound quality and image quality. This week, um, for these weird times that we're some big stuff that we will talk about later on, and he's one of the big arguments or sort of people who argue for universal basic income, and he's often quoted in that particular argument. Again, really interesting given where we're at economically in Britain at the moment, with so many people being furloughed and paid for by the government. But Rutger, welcome. You've brought a big idea at just the right time,
Thanks.
and you begin this book with
What really depresses me is that like this video has 100,000 views for like a great person, and like some idiot like Ben Shapiro gets like 2 million views for an equivalent video.
you say is sort of a simple big idea. What is it?
It's a very simple idea. It's in fact that most people deep down are pretty decent.
Why do you say that, and why is that the starting point for a big?
There's been this very old and deep theory within our culture, within specifically Western culture, that goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks, and that you find with the Christian church fathers as well, and so many of the Enlightenment philosophers. And that is, I think, embedded at the heart of our capitalist system, which says that most people are selfish, and that our civilization is only a thin veneer. And that especially during times of crises, supposedly we human beings reveal our true selves and we become nasty and we become very selfish and
But it's also
the
true.
animal and
So
the
I
beast comes out.
I basically believe that there's both. It's kind of both true that we're both people are mostly good and mostly bad. And I think the bad is largely a result of the Gorth, like I've explained, which both directly manipulates you to be bad, then indirectly makes your soul degenerate to be idiotic and bad, and also has literally guided evolution through that mechanism to make you like biologically more idiotic and bad.
every one of us. And I think that is fundamentally wrong.
I mean, it's the basis for so many bits of philosophy. I mean, you start with sort of the Hobbes and Rousseau sort of opposition. Just explain
Yeah,
that.
so Thomas Hobbes, British philosopher, had his famous book, The Leviathan, one of the most important works in political philosophy, incredibly influential. And so his view was that back when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, we lived these lives that were nasty, brutish, and short. And there was a kind of war of all against all going on. It was like a terrible life in the state of nature. But we somehow got out of this by sort of electing or choosing a Leviathan, a very powerful guy. It's usually a guy, sort of a king or a monarch who keeps each and every one of us in check. That's
So I don't really see it like that. What I see is that there's always been tribalism in that like civilization has just created larger scale tribalism, and the cause and there has been the struggle, but it has been continuing up until now because we've had all these wars even after the advent of civilization, and again the cause of this tribalism and this violence is not innate quote human nature, but it's a result of degeneracy caused by the Gorth.
really dominant. The selfish view of human nature is so often used as a legitimization of hierarchy, right? Because if we cannot trust each other, then we need a Leviathan to control us. Now, Rousseau, the French philosopher, had the
Yeah,
opposite
and
view.
again,
He said, no,
that's
no,
what
no.
the Gorth wants, just wants to create shitty societies because it wants basically you to suffer. So it does that. It makes you require a Leviathan.
Actually, the state of nature, we lived lives that were pretty good. We were
But
relatively healthy.
actually, that's not. Again, that is also not really true. And again, like without the Gorth, the sort of noble savage idea would be completely true, and also the noble civilized person would be completely true. Um, so there isn't. I don't really see an opposition between the hunter gatherer lifestyle and the sort of civilized quote lifestyle that we've had until now. To me, see in my theory of the development of humans, I all put that under stage one, and that is like, there's this thing called the human adulthood movement or something. There's this guy who sort of come up with this thing, and his idea is sort of more closer to mine. And in fact, I got kind of inspired by that. But of course, he sort of made a cold out of this, and this sort of become, and it's kind of weird, his thing. But it's kind of similar to that, where stage zero is the animal stage. Then the stage one is when we actually start to become human around 2 million years ago, and now we're still at stage one, and it's like about time to reach stage two.
Healthy, we were free, but then became civilization, and that's when everything went wrong.
Yeah.
We started living in villages and
See,
cities
to me, those are just like stages 1A and stages 1B. That to me, it's the same thing.
and doing agriculture, and our health deteriorated. The age of warfare began, and so this is the big debate in philosophy that's been taking place for centuries. Was Hobbes right, or was Rousseau right?
Well, neither, like I
And the
said.
truth is, we're somewhere in between, aren't we?
Well, that's sort of the usual boring, dull answer. I at one point, yeah, at one point I
Well,
had the idea.
I have the pessimistic view of both. It's like it was bad before and it was bad after. Because stage one is fundamentally bad, and in fact, it's a mistake that should never even have existed. Stage one of human development is just a perversion that is caused by the Gorth. And of course, the Gorth actually prevents stage two from ever being realized. So what would happen without the Gorth is that you just kind of gently, naturally sort of go from stage zero to stage two. And so you'd have that first sort of noble savage stage that quite quickly sort of gives rise to civilization, and then you just sort of you don't think ever, you don't have any tribalism, you don't have any conflict, you don't have any oppressive social norms, so you just go from being sort of simple-minded like an animal to being then have the wisdom of a human, but without having any of that crap that is characteristic of stage one, and is precisely what they call the quote human condition.
Of calling my book Rousseau was right. The interesting thing is that so often Hobbes is seen as the realist, right? He's described as the father of realism, and still today we often equate realism with pessimism and with cynicism. If someone comes along and says, I've got these dreams, I've got hopes for the future.
But the reason for that is again that the Gorth makes you believe that, and partly it's because it's actually true, because since the Gorth is now very powerful, it literally is realistic to be pessimistic, because the Gorth is going to ensure that bad things happen in the end. But at the same time, it also knows that if you believe that there's going to be a bad outcome, it's more likely for that bad outcome to happen. So it also wants you to be pessimistic for that reason.
Then we often say, well, be a bit more realistic, where we mean, be a bit more cynical. And so Rousseau has often been described as this romantic French believer in these dreams that will never come to pass.
No, he's Genevan.
What really struck me while researching this book is that if you look at the latest state of anthropology and archaeology and hundreds of scientists, doing all this path-breaking work, you're like, but this is pretty much what I read in the Discourse on Inequality, that Rousseau wrote in the 18th century. I'm not saying he was right about everything, but he was sort of right when he said that civilization, for the biggest part of the history of civilization, was actually a disaster. Our health deteriorated, war started, we got hierarchy, we got patriarchy.
Yeah, but the thing is that there already was, there's already war, there's already hierarchy, there's all those patriarchy, there were all those things already before.
It was a really bad decision.
There has never been a stage without that recently, again, as a result of the Gorth.
And what you've done is you've gone through a load of sort of examples of stories, some of which people may think they know, which you then sort of debunk slightly. And the one a lot of people will have seen in the newspapers was The Real Lord of the Flies. And you concluded from one example that if you leave a bunch of kids on a desert island, they don't all turn into savages.
And it's obviously, it's not a scientific experiment, right? It's just one example that we have. The only thing that I'm saying is, if millions of kids still have to read Lord of the Flies in school, then let's also tell them about that one time that it actually happened. It's the only time in all of world history that we know of that kids actually did shipwreck on an island. And it's the happiest story ever. It's a story of friendship and of comradeship and of cooperation.
Wait, what is that story?
Yeah, people wouldn't believe it if it was fiction. They would say, well, it's very sentimental. But here we are. It really happened.
So what actually happened for those who haven't seen
So
this?
you've got 6 Tongan kids. Tonga is an island group in the Pacific Ocean who are bored with school. They're at an Anglican boarding school, and they don't like the school meals. They don't like all the homework. So they're like, you know what? We're going to go on an adventure. This is 1965. Um, they make a big mistake on the first night. They're in the boat and they fall asleep. Then there's a big storm, and so they drift for
That
8 days.
that sounds like just a made up like premise of the story. Like that sounds like a kind of thing that wouldn't happen in real life.
Then they shipwreck on this small uninhabited
And
island
8 days, how do they even survive 8 days? Like, yeah.
that people haven't lived there for more than 100 years, and they managed to survive there for 15 months by cooperating really well. So they form teams of two to tend to the garden, two to cook, two to be on the lookout for ships. Sometimes they're in fights, but then one of them would go to one side of the island and the other to the other side of the island, cool off a little bit, come back and say sorry. I mean, it wasn't like they were having a fun time. I mean, it was very hard. Sometimes they were very hungry or thirsty. But then after 50 months, they were rescued by an Australian captain who was just by accident fishing there. And they became the best friends. Also with the Australian captain, they started to work for him. And so 50 years later, I managed to track down 2 of those
Oh, that's so cool.
real Lord of
This
the
is
Flies kids.
this is really so cool.
And yeah, they had lived happy and fulfilling lives.
And that's not the only example you found, is it, of people not descending, into chaos, hatred, and violence? I mean, basically, you're saying that people themselves are kind of nice and dull.
Sort of, yeah. It's what biologists
Wait, what?
call
Did you say dull? Like dull?
survival of the friendliest. So what has happened for millennia is that it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids, and so also had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And this is really what explains the success of our species. If you ask the question, why us? Why have we conquered the globe? And why didn't the Neanderthals do it, or the chimpanzees, or the bonobos?
Yeah,
Right?
but
Why?
it's not entirely true because it's also true that tribes that were more oppressive to their own members, but to keep them in check and to sort of keep them disciplined, actually were dominant over tribes where people were more free and were nicer to each other. In fact. And that's precisely what has led to all this horrible history of oppression. And look, come on, look at history. I mean, there's just been so much horrible, like massacres and stuff. I mean, and just inequalities, just all sorts of horrible stuff. And it would be naive to just sort of have that kind of a vision, honestly. And and again, the reason for all this horror is the Gorth. It's the Gorth that is causing this. Because yes, fundamentally, with our big brains like that, if people weren't being completely uh, made to degenerate by the Gorth, they would be able to use those brains to be nice to each other. And the fact that they don't is a result of the degeneracy and the manipulation by the Gorth.
Why did we do it? The answer is that we're really good at cooperating. Individually, we're not that smart. If you do an intelligence test and have a human toddler compete with other animals, like a pig, for example, usually the toddler loses.
Really?
But what we can do is we can really cooperate on a scale that other species just can't. And our bodies are designed to do this. So, for example, one fascinating thing is that we have got really special eyes as human beings. So I can see you looking at me right now, and that is because you've got white, and I've got that as well. We all have that. We've got white around our eyes, right? Which means that we can sort of follow each other's gazes, right? You can see what other people are looking at. All the other primates don't have this. They have dark around their eyes. It's a little bit like they are poker players wearing shades, right? But we just give away our gaze to everyone, which makes it much easier to trust each other.
I mean, what have you thought, looking at our current state of being in Britain during the coronavirus lockdown? I mean, again, we're in sort of really uncharted territory. Some people would have predicted chaos, that there'd be mass civil disobedience. There's no way people would live by the rules for more than a week or two. That people would be angry.
Yeah, well,
It reminded me so much.
how ironic that it's again law and order right wingers that have been largely responsible for being the unruly element.
Of what happened in Britain on the eve of the Second World War. So before the bombs started falling on London and other cities in the UK, elites were really panicking. They thought, you know what, people are going to go nuts. The Germans will break the British morale very quickly, and then the population will panic, and the army will have its hands full controlling the masses, right? They can't even fight the enemy because they'll be too busy at home. That was the fear that people like Churchill really had. Then what happened is that the bombs did start falling, and the opposite happened. The keep calm and carry on spirit came over London and other cities, right? There was this wonderful British humor and jokes. You know, there were sort of the buildings destroyed in cafes and restaurants, and people would put out signs in front of them that said more open than usual. And it didn't have a big impact on the economy. Actually, war production increased. And then the question was, how do we explain this? Because especially in 1942, the experts had to decide, what are we going to do with our Air Force, right? Are we going to bomb the Germans, like the cities, or focus on strategic targets, railroads, or, I don't know, industry or something like that? And so they thought that the response from the British population was typically British. You know, it was the British spirit, that must be the explanation. But the Germans, well, obviously they were, had a very weak moral character, so it would be easy to break their spirit. And then they bombed Germany 10 times as heavily as Britain. And, exactly the same thing happened again. The cities that were bombed the heaviest actually became more resilient and saw increased wartime production compared to cities that were not bombed or not bombed as heavy. Because it wasn't British culture, it was human nature. This is just how people behave during times of crisis. They pull together. So now we have seen this epidemic, the corona crisis, and it's literally the same playbook. It's again Downing Street and the experts saying, you know what, people will get tired of this.
Yeah, well, right-wingers, again, they're just unruly savages, so they can't handle it. But other people have handled it well.
There will be this fatigue, with the lockdown. And that was one of the reasons why the UK was slow to go into lockdown, because they thought the public couldn't handle it. And look what it has cost us, in terms of lives. So this is the problem over and over again. When elites think about human nature, they look in the mirror and they assume that other people are as selfish as they are. But that's not the case. Power corrupts, but most people are pretty decent.
Why have we then spent 70 years still thinking that there's such a thing as British exceptionalism and not really understanding that it's everybody?
I think that's another truth about human nature, and it's a darker truth, right? It is that
nationalism.
We also have this capacity for tribalism and group behavior, right?
Yep.
It's the dark side of friendliness. So on the one hand, I'm saying that human beings have evolved to be friendly, but then sometimes that friendliness is exactly the problem, right? We sometimes do the most horrible things in the name of comradeship and of loyalty.
But because it's friendliness only for people of your
group. It was fascinating to discover that actually empathy and sort of xenophobia are often two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and like literally, the better I've said that like psychopaths actually make better moral decisions because they have no empathy at all, and so they can just think things logically. And as a result, they'll just like minimize suffering in a much more logical way if that's actually their intention, but they're better able to perceive that as a good intention. It's like ironically, psychopaths are better people than the average person.
You feel empathy for your own group, for your own people, and then you distrust the outgroup. This is the dynamic that plays out again and again in our history.
Well, I mean, if people are sort of fundamentally nice, I mean, we kind of have to address, the bad stuff. Why?
And see, personally, like I also think I'm a better person. Like I pretty much think most people are really shitty, and I really hate them because they're like really precisely they're tribalistic and they're evil, and as a result, I don't feel empathy for people. But I'm actually a better person, and I actually because I know I'm able to actually think things logically, and I know actually what's required to help people, and not just rely on my feelings.
Why do bad things happen? Why do bad people exist? And, and also what you just mentioned, really, which is the elites being selfish, useless, whatever it might be, venal. What's going on there? I mean, let's start with, I mean, you have to, I mean, and you do it in the book as well, where you talk about the 21st century.
But I think there's a mistake with people, like left-leaning people tend to sort of think that the elites are bad and other people aren't bad. And see, I don't see that at all. I pretty much see everyone as equally bad.
very ultimate European evil remains the
Hmm.
Nazis and the
Yeah, yeah,
Holocaust. So where does that
hmm,
fit in to your theory of
yeah.
human nature?
What's interesting is that after the Second World War, there was this whole new generation of social psychologists. People will have probably heard of, Philip Zimbardo with his famous Stanford Prison Experiment, or Stanley Milgram with his studies he did at Yale, where supposedly people were willing to shock random strangers, give them very dangerous electric shocks. And so the message of those scientists back then in the 60s was that, you know what, how do we explain the Holocaust? It's because there's a Nazi in each and every one of us, right? So it was the return of veneer theory. It's just below the
Yeah.
surface. We're all capable of it.
No,
Now, I
I and
think that is wrong.
I think
I take a lot of time,
I actually don't think there's a Nazi in the vast majority of people, and even like I would say everyone, depending on the circumstance. But some people more or less. Um, it's there is both a potential for Nazi and the potential for being very decent. There's
your
both
book to
at the same
criticize
time.
those experiments, but then still, you got to ask yourself the question: how is this possible, right? How do we get there? Now, what my most important objection is to these kind of psychological experiments is that they trivialize our history, right? You can write libraries full of books about the very complex historical process.
Because I'd say lots of people want to do the right thing. They want to be good, and like often given the chance, they will. But even when they do that, have they're so idiotic that they don't really have a proper understanding of what it means to be good, and of like they don't have a proper understanding of ethics, and like I explained, like about the trolley problem thing, where you've got these two train tracks and a different number of people on them, and like people are just like they're completely inconsistent, and they don't have a solid foundation for ethics, and as a result, they're not even capable of being good if they want to. See, they cannot be good at will because they literally don't know what good is,
That led to Auschwitz, right? And there are so many different things at play
and as a result, like lots of Germans probably even thought they were being good by eliminating the Jews, right? Because they're actually helping their country.
here. Um, the role of distance, for example, the technologies that played a role, the sort of brainwashing that was going on at the same time, how evil became normalized year by year by year. But obviously, I mean, as I said, libraries full of books. Um, I felt that these sort of psychological experiments trivialized the Holocaust because they're like, well, there's an easy explanation. There's a Nazi in each and every one of us. Well, it's not as simple as that.
Well,
But
then
it
take
is
us
as
to the
simple as that.
next part of
Okay.
the argument.
So, one important thing that we have to talk about is the role of distance in the history of violence. So, we've all watched way too many series on Netflix and HBO and Game of Thrones and you name it, that give us a depiction of violence as if it's easy, as if and we can all do it. That's absolutely wrong. We can't do it. We know, for example, or most of us can't do it. We know from historical research that only 15 to 25% of Allied soldiers during the Second World War were actually capable of firing their guns. It's just, there's a very strong tendency in our psychology that at the
Really,
moment that we
is
have to
that
do
really
this, we
true?
can't do it.
Is that
Especially if the
true?
enemy is really close. Bayonets, for example, most bayonets throughout history have never been used. And the reason is quite simple because it's just psychologically too hard. If you look at the Battle of the Somme during the
Yeah, I
First World War,
like
of the Battle
honestly,
of
I don't like. I think about it, and I find it horrifying. Just the idea of doing it. It's like, ugh, you know.
Waterloo, where Napoleon was defeated.
Like,
Almost
I mean, there are all sorts of people I hate. Like, there's tons of people that like literally I would consider it be better for the world for them to not exist. But I still hate the idea of like killing them. So yeah,
all of the wounds were not caused by bayonets. Almost none of them were caused by bayonets, but it's almost all of artillery. Because it's much easier to push a button and then have an explosion far away, right? So then we can actually be violent. So
yeah,
distance is sort of a way to overcome this. Not only sort of physical distance, but also psychological distance. So we can also dehumanize the other. And I mean, it's a
yeah.
terrible truth about our species that we are capable of this, but I'm just saying that it doesn't come natural to us. It's not easy. I mean, sex is easy, right? Most of us like it and love it. Food is easy, right?
Sex is easy. That is like the biggest falsehood I've practically ever heard.
It's perfectly understandable why
Food,
it's
sex, like it's for me, yeah, but like obviously it isn't easy for most people. I mean, it's obviously not easy to have it done back.
good for us and why it's good for the body. Violence,
Food,
actually,
yeah.
when people kill someone
Food, yeah.
else, for example, when soldiers come back from wars and they've killed someone else, they've also destroyed something within themselves, right?
Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
traumatized, they often have PTSD, etc., which suggests to me that we're not born to do this, even though we are capable of it.
I mean, that
It's
explains,
it's it's the Gorth that's doing it. It's the Gorth that's making you do it.
I suppose, some of the mechanism as to how you get armies to do bad things. But I mean, I suppose we still have to kind of work out the thinking behind it, don't we? We know that somebody somewhere has bad thoughts, or that all people have bad thoughts to some degree, and how that squares up with what you're saying about our basic
Yeah,
nature.
yeah.
Is it that we all have good and bad thoughts, and the good naturally overpowers the bad in most cases, or
I sort of have a double view on this. So on the one hand, I'm saying that your view of human nature is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what you assume in yourself and in other people is often what you get at. If you assume that most people are selfish and aggressive, then you'll design your society in such a way that it will bring out the worst in yourself and all of us, right? You'll design your company in a way that you'll get a lot of cutthroat competition and people will behave, in a very nasty Hobbesian way. You'll
Yeah, and that's sort of that's what right wingers want. They like love hardship. They love nastiness.
do the same thing at schools and prisons and maybe our democracies as well. And I think we can turn it around because if we have a more hopeful view of human nature, we can start designing our institutions in a very different way, more egalitarian, where we actually rely on the intrinsic motivation of people, to make the world a little bit of a better place. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm also saying is that we do have sort of two legs, sort of the social leg and the selfish leg. And, it's the question is what leg do we train? But we also have a natural preference, that is deeply embedded in our evolutionary history for the social leg. And this is something you clearly see when how people behave during crisis, They have an intuitive response that is all about solidarity and cooperation, right? They don't really have to think about it. It's just what they immediately do. And that is exactly what has made our species so successful.
I mean, have you worked out yourself where because a lot of this is sort
Yeah,
of
but only solidarity only unfortunately solidarity within your own group. And that unfortunately there's this tribal dynamic, and that is what has been the cause of the vast majority of unnecessary deaths. In fact, is the deaths through war as a result of tribalism.
belief system. It sounds quite religious in a way, sort of what you believe about good and evil. What's your own background on that front? How religious are you?
So my father is a Protestant minister. So I grew up in a religious household, not very strict in any way. I mean, he's a free thinker. He's a bit of a philosopher himself. But yeah, then you have this moment as I think so many of us have when you're 17 or 18 years old and you're wondering, what should I believe? Which dogmas are true? Did Jesus die on the cross for my sins? Is there a God? Is there life after death? And that was the moment when I became an atheist. It was only later, and also while researching this book, that I became sort of less interested in the question, is this or that true? But more interested in the question, what is the effect of us believing this or that? So what is the performative power of ideas?
But it's so like a religious book in a way that you've even come up with your own 10 commandments, haven't you?
Couldn't resist, sorry.
Yeah. 10 ways to live your life in a good way. I mean, can we just go through them?
Sure.
10 rules to live by. The first one
When in doubt,
is, when in doubt, assume the best.
That is so much like Jordan Peterson. That's like the 12 rules for life. When assume that you have something to learn from other people.
I mean, so often when we communicate, we don't
He's like the negative doppelganger of Jordan Peterson. He's like the good the good version.
really understand each other. I mean, even though human beings have been designed to cooperate.
It's so sad that like Jordan Peterson has so many followers and someone like this. See, if again, if it weren't for the Gorth, this person would have way more followers, and Jordan Peterson would have like one follower.
Communicate and connect. I mean, we make a lot of mistakes here, right? So, for example, on WhatsApp, you get an emoji and you're looking at the emoji and like, what does that mean? And then often when we are in doubt, we assume the worst. We think that someone else has bad intentions. I think that's a bad strategy for a couple of reasons. So in the first place, most people are pretty decent. So when you assume the best, you'll be right most of the time. In the second place, if someone doesn't really mean well, then your behavior, your positive behavior, can have an effect that psychologists call non-complementary, right? So someone does really nasty against you and you behave in a positive way, and then the other one is like, oh, well, maybe I should change my behavior as well, right?
Yeah, that
Human
is
beings are
that is the
mirroring
thing.
each other all the time.
That is the thing.
So if you're having a good time together, then you're friendly to me, I'm friendly to you, and that can go on for a very long time.
I know that can be a
But
thing.
it also goes the other way around, right? You can also go in a circle of nasty behavior. The way to break that is to go against your intuition and to be nice to someone who's not nice to you, which is, as I said, non-complementary behavior. Now, then you can say,
But
but
some,
wait,
some people just stay shitty all the time, and will just think that you're weak for being nice.
wait a minute, Rutger. There are still like con men out there, right? There are still people who want to rip you off. And then I'm saying, yes, that's true. And we can't change that fact. And it's just collateral damage. You should accept it. Because what's the alternative? Do you want to live your whole life distrusting everyone around you just to make sure that you'll never be conned? I mean, that's a way too high price to pay. It's much better to say, okay, I accept that a couple of times in my life I'll be conned by the very tiny majority of people who do this, and then can live a full life trusting other people. I think that's a good price to pay. And I mean, the alternative, if you've never been conned, then you should ask yourself the question, what's wrong with me, right? Is my basic attitude to life trusting enough? Maybe I should visit a therapist or something.
Yeah, sure. I get conned quite easily because I always, I listen to people like on the street who want like stuff from me, and then I buy it, and then like actually I realize that was like just a con. Um, or like I give them money. I don't even buy anything. I give them money, and then I realize it's a con.
Do you leave your doors unlocked at night, I wonder? I mean, this reminds me of my conversation with my Australian family.
But I know that like if you're just like kind of friendly, but like just in a sort of like polite and smiley, but you don't actually act like you don't actually talk much, you're not entertaining particularly, then people look down on you. Because I mean, I've sort of, I tried to be friendly, but like, no, people just look down on me because I don't actually, I'm not entertaining. And people really look up to be entertaining, or if not entertaining, then sort of project dominance. You have to be one or the other, either entertaining or project dominance, or both. If you're just like nice and you don't at least project dominance or entertainment, that people won't like you.
My wife's family, who all leave their doors unlocked at night and don't seem at all worried about anything. And it's totally unimaginable because not only do I bolt 3 bolts across my door at night, I put the burglar alarm on and I go upstairs.
Well, I mean, you don't have to be totally irrational about it. For example, I lived in Utrecht, one of the big cities in the Netherlands, where people on average own, I don't know, 2 or 3 bikes. So everyone has a lot of bikes. And of course I lock my bicycle there, right? Because there's just a small group of people who often, have difficult backgrounds or are addicted and are stealing bike after bike after bike. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't lock your bike or anything. But I am saying that you should be really careful about being too distrusting of other people and
Right,
worrying
and again,
about being
if with basic income, that might not happen anymore, right? Because nobody would actually need, that to survive or anything. So, yeah.
ripped off all the time. Because maybe, it's just
Okay.
a price to pay.
Number 2, think in win-win scenarios.
Yeah. So very often when we sort of talk about doing good things, we think that people have to suffer for it, right? And then someone does something nice, and but that's just for his or her career or LinkedIn profile, or just because it gave him or her a good feeling, right? Because people just want to be a do-gooder. And I was just like, but what would the alternative be? Would we really want to live in a world where every time you do something nice, you get nauseous feeling, right? That you feel terrible. I mean, what kind of hell would that be? I mean, luckily we live in a world where doing good also often feels good. I mean, that's what evolution has done for us.
Yeah,
That's
that's good.
pretty
That's
great,
it's
terrific
win-win.
news,
It's
right?
win-win.
Um,
Yeah,
so
there's this idea, yeah, that's like selfishness is not good, and that like anything that you do for your own benefit is sort of like not all that worthy, even if it's actually helping others. And I think that's a mistake. It's perfectly fine to do things just in a selfish for a selfish reason, as long as it's also kind of benefits everyone.
um, yeah, I think that very often sort of the best deals work for
And like often, ironically, it's the same people who think that yeah, you should be like, you shouldn't do selfish things like that. That at the same time, advocate for completely selfish societal structures, right? That for this kind of societal structures where some people are super poor and some people are super rich, it kind of goes together, in fact.
both sides. Um, as you mentioned earlier,
Like
that I
it's the sort of fake altruism. I don't know. Yeah, I don't even know how to. It's like fake anti-selfishness. Yeah, it's like anti-selfishness, but which is actually selfish.
I've written quite a bit about universal basic income. One of the things that I really like about giving the poor free money is that it is an investment that pays for itself, because you have to spend less on healthcare costs and judicial costs and police costs and you name it.
Yes, that's
It's
that's
really an
another good thing. I haven't even like mentioned that on my main video on that. And
investment
yeah,
with a great return, and I think that's the kind of view we need to adopt here.
Okay, number 3 is ask more questions. Why does that help?
Well, we talked about this, that people may get the impression that I've written this happy clappy book about follow your intuition, etc. I think that's not a good idea. Empathy can very often be a bad guide, right? That we sort of think
yeah,
that we know what the other person is feeling, but in
yeah,
reality, we often don't. So that it's often just better to ask a question.
yeah.
I also give the example of the golden rule, right? How do you say it in English? Like, do not do unto others what you don't want to be done unto yourself, right? And then the other
So you
formulation
got it
as well.
right.
Yeah. I think what's wrong with the golden rule is that it assumes that you know what the other person wants, right? You don't know that.
Yeah, yeah,
And the other person may be different from you. So
yeah.
there's also the platinum rule. George Bernard Shaw had a great expression. Maybe you can read it from the book because I don't know it by heart. It's the last line there.
Yeah. Do not do unto others as you would that they should do unto you. Their tastes may be
Exactly.
different. Okay, number 4 is temper your empathy, train your
Yeah.
compassion.
Well, we talked a little bit about this. Empathy often works
Yeah.
as a spotlight, right? As a searchlight. As you focus on the one person or group that you care about, the rest of the world fades into darkness, right? And empathy is just very limited. You can't.
Empathy, yeah, and the problem with empathy, I think you should cultivate empathy more for your own happiness. It's like if it makes you feel good to feel empathy, you should do it. But you shouldn't base your decisions on empathy. You should base your decisions on goodwill, on an intellectual idea, and that should be directed precisely towards everybody, and absolutely not be sort of selective for your group, for your tribe.
Feel empathy for everyone. You can't just do that. And psychologists emphasize that compassion is different. It's a bit more. You take a bit more of a distance, right? It's a bit.
Yeah, so he's talking about compassion, but again, compassion to me is also an emotion. So compassion is sort of like it's still sort of emotion, but it's just that you don't actually feel exactly what you imagine they would feel, but it's more like you feel kind of for them. Compassion is kind of like sympathy, of what you call sympathy, which logically would be a synonym of empathy, like etymologically, but like instead it's more like that. But I advocate just emotions are super important, but they're super important from your own perspective of just enjoying living existence. Emotions shouldn't be a guideline for making decisions unless those decisions actually like have to do with your own emotions. So in that sense, like there's this idea that you should also often follow your emotions for like choosing a partner, and to some extent, if it doesn't contradict like your rational thoughts, like if your rational thoughts think that that person's a good partner for you, then following your emotions is also a good idea because, um, well, precisely you're choosing a partner largely to feel good, right? You're not doing it for some sort of noble higher purpose, right? You're just doing it for your own emotions. So if you're already feeling good emotions around that person, well, it's likely that that will continue. And so in that sense, it's your emotions will be a good guideline. But again, you don't actually do it. You don't actually follow directly your emotions. See, it's more out of a logical thought process whereby you recognize that you're likely to keep on experiencing those emotions. So you still should always just make decisions based on logic.
Bit more detached, it's a bit more rational, and you sort of don't feel what the other person is feeling, but you do feel with that person. And you can even, there's even a real difference in the brain here. So when people feel empathy, a different part of the brain lights up than when they feel compassion.
Okay, number 5 is try to understand the other, even if you don't get where they're coming from. And I guess you have to kind of go to extremes on this, don't you? You know, I have to try and understand the Nazi. I have to try and understand the racist.
And it's so important to make the distinction here between understanding and condoning.
Yeah.
Because if we understand why young men blow themselves up, right? Why they kill themselves and killing a lot of other innocent people in the process. If we understand that, then we can maybe try and make sure that it doesn't happen again, right? That's the only.
But
It's
again,
not the same as.
I don't think you need to actually be able to feel it, you know? As long as you like know the causes just on a purely abstract level, that's enough. Because right? Because if you know them, then you know what needs to be done to prevent it to be happening. So that yeah, I know there's a certain type of especially in maybe a more sort of self-development kind of community where people you sort of exhorted to really feel all this stuff, and actually no, it's fine to not feel anything.
As condoning it. And what experts emphasize is that very often these, for example, the foot soldiers of terrorist organizations, they're not motivated by a strong grasp of the ideology, right? There were a lot of people who went to Syria who had very little idea about sort of the Islamist faith. Some of them had books with sort of Quran for dummies, in their backpacks. So why did they do what they do? Well, the terrible truth is that they often did it out of friendship and out of comradeship and out of this finally having this feeling of belonging to something.
And also like having a mission. It's like you feel like you're actually you're useful and you've got some sort of goal in your life and some sort of a higher purpose.
Finding meaning in your life. Again, this is not about condoning. It's about understanding, because if you understand that, I think then there are ways to design the most effective counterterrorism programs to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And
again, just mainly basic income. That way, then you just create a much better society overall. Lots, in these Arab countries, like they've got a completely messed up culture, which involves like, they're sort of stuck. They're all sort of try to out macho each other between the men. Then they're not able to like interact with females, and so obviously that creates problems. So obviously you gotta also make a culture that's just much better overall. And that, well, if there are any actual laws that put this into law, then obviously those have to be repealed. And then, of course, you just have to sort of collectively agree to cultivate these better values.
what are those most effective counterterrorism programs? Well, they're often the opposite of what we do. Right, so often we think that you have to sort of really
Punish.
crack down
Yeah,
and
no.
expand the surveillance apparatus and that kind of thing. But if you look at the most effective counterterrorism programs, well, you go to somewhere like Denmark, where they have this outreach program to drink tea with people who are potentially about to be radicalized,
Yeah, that sounds
and
better.
offer them a job and
Yeah.
a conversation.
I mean, I was thinking more in the actual countries of like more like Muslim countries, but yeah, obviously, like for radical people in Europe, you just sort of again you create a culture that's sort of more I don't know how to say just friendly with everyone and that discusses things at the same time, not just and that doesn't just do a sort of safe space council culture kind of thing where you don't talk about things. You create something an environment that's friendly, but you talk about everything openly.
etc. Now, I know this sounds all very sentimental and naive, but for example, Aarhus had this moment where they tried this, and before that, they had like 30, 35 people going to Syria. The year after that, it was just one. So there's a huge amount of scientific evidence that this kind of approach, where even treating potential terrorists with a certain kind of compassion, it just has better results. And again, not about condoning anything. It's about understanding.
Okay, number 6 is love your own as others love their own.
I think we also have to sort of accept that human beings are limited creatures, right? We just can't love all of humanity. That's not what we're capable of. I mean, some Buddhist philosophers or meditators pretend they can do it, and then they have meditated for 50,000 hours or something like that. And then they say, oh, that's an example to us all. But I'm like, I don't have 50,000 hours. I want to live my life, right?
And especially in practice that they're still selfish. So they're not as much, but they're still. I mean, look at these sort of guru people. They're all still doing like weird, selfish stuff. They like sort of have weird stuff with like their cars and big houses and like women and it's okay. The point is that that is actually not a problem. It's fine.
So I think that in a certain way, it's acceptable that when there is a terrible attack, say you live in London and there's a terrible attack in London, it's acceptable then that you sort of feel more empathy for that than if there is a sort of terrible thing going on 10,000 miles away, right, in some other distant country. That's who we are. We are limited creatures. The only thing,
But I kind of disagree that you should feel more empathy for people you don't know, but that are still part of like your own people. That is where you should draw the line. Is like, okay, I mean, obviously, if in any case, emotions are just emotions. So if you feel it, you feel it. But you certainly shouldn't like have more goodwill towards the people, especially like strangers, but that are part of like your tribe. Don't do that. Don't have more goodwill for some people than for others just based on the fact that they belong to your own tribe.
that we have to remember is that those people far away are human beings just like us, with the same
Yeah.
human nature.
Why does that help us, though? Why does that help us be better people?
Well, look, for example, at the, classic example is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it's this terrible cycle of empathy and then vengeance that goes on and on and on. So there's an attack, and then one group feels real empathy for the victims, and there's like, okay, we need vengeance, and then boom, an attack on the
That
other
whole
side,
thing
and
is
then,
just
empathy,
so
and it goes on
ridiculous.
and on and on, right?
That
But
whole
it's
thing
sort of
is
the
so
same
ridiculous.
dynamic
So
that is at play
ridiculous.
on both sides. And sort of you
Yeah.
tend to forget that, what drives you is often what drives the people that are so distant from you as well.
Okay, now we get to the difficult one. Number 7 is avoid the news.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, the news is...
you're really down
Yeah,
on the news.
sorry. Well, just to make sure, I make a distinction between the news and journalism. Not all journalism is the news. The news is really about the sensationalist, the incidental, the stuff that makes you a bit depressed. There's even a term for this in psychology. Psychologists talk about mean world syndrome. So people who've watched too much of the news have become more cynical and depressed, etc. So it's not good for you. It's a bit like a drug.
But are you sure that's true if you take our current example with coronavirus, in which you say people on the whole are behaving well, and people are obsessed with the news? News audiences are massive, and people are just being informed.
Yeah. It's understandable because we're living through history right now, right? So it's obviously very important to know what's going on. But then sort of the daily numbers about the number of deaths and infections and how full the hospitals, do we really need to know all of that? I think that often it makes people more anxious and depressed and doesn't really help them in their lives, right? But then, I mean...
Doesn't it help people work out what's gone wrong? And where their leaders may have made mistakes, which is also important.
Yes, and that's investigative journalism, right? That helps us to zoom out and to focus at the bigger structural forces that govern our lives. So what I always recommend to people is just, start with the Sunday newspaper. Just read that the rest of the week. Make sure you finished it, right? And then sort of ignore the breaking news, ignore the sort of the push alerts, etc., etc. You can easily do without that.
Number 8 is don't punch Nazis.
Yeah. So there's a certain kind of activism, Rebecca Solnit, one of my favorite authors, once remarked, that is more, that cares more about sort of being right or sort of feeling good about being right than about actually achieving results. Sort of this moral righteousness, you see that often. So I think I get in the chapter I give the example of sort of left-wing activists who like to punch Nazis, and it's like, we're fighting fascism. And then my question is that really the most effective approach, right? Because when you drop a bomb on the Middle East, that's often, the best way to recruit more terrorists, right? It sort of really fits the narrative of those who you're saying you're fighting.
Yeah,
The
and
same.
like that will just vindicate if you punch like right wingers, because that's what he means by Nazis, right? And like you're just gonna make Ben Shapiro right that all these lefty activists just want to punch people. So yeah,
Is with punching Nazis, right? It's probably a great way
but it's important to be harsh towards Nazism and not just like actual swastika Nazism, but all Nazism.
for Nazis to recruit more Nazis and for them to give to really feel this feeling of being oppressed.
And like I've maybe just to remind you, Nazism is nationalism.
You can turn this around.
Nationalism is
So there's
Nazism.
one town in Germany, what's it called, Wunsiedel, that sort of did the opposite, and they when they had a Nazi march of neo Nazis every year in their town, and so they said, you know what, we're going to make this some kind of benefit march for the good cause.
Oh, really?
So they promised that for every 10 meter that the Nazis donated, or walked, they would donate a certain amount of money to a group that helps neo-Nazis get out of those kind of groups. I think that is just hilarious, and it's just
Yeah.
a much better way to try
Yeah,
and
I like
to
that.
try and
I like
reach out.
Which takes you on to number 9, which is come out of the closet. Don't be ashamed to
Yeah.
do good.
So I'm a fan of the film Love Actually, right? And that is, it takes a lot of courage
Oh,
to
yeah.
say that as a man of 32 years old, right?
And as
Um,
an intellectual. I quite like that movie. I sort of forgotten it, but I remember I enjoyed it.
it's often very sort of, people find it hard to come out for the good because they're afraid that they'll be dismissed as sentimental or naive, or that you're a do-gooder, you're just doing this for the money or for your LinkedIn profile or something like that. The difficulty here is that when you do not come out for it, then you'll put it in quarantine, right? And then it cannot spread anymore. We know that human behavior is contagious, right? Not only viruses are contagious, human behavior as well.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
admit it.
that's a very good
You
point.
just like the movie, especially the beginning with the part about Heathrow, where all these happy people are hugging each other. You just like it. Just admit it.
Okay, finally, be realistic. Now, some people
Yeah,
may think,
I
well, that's a bit
I agree
of
about
a
that.
counter to end on, isn't it?
No, it's the most important thing, actually.
Don't, but like regarding the other thing, like don't be afraid to be nice also, and don't be afraid to don't be afraid to look silly because you're too nice, or because like he said, because you actually care about good things.
Trying to do in this book is to redefine what it means to be a realist. The realist is someone who has hope for the future and who has a more hopeful view of human nature. I think that is entirely realistic. And it's the cynic who's really naive and who needs to update his view of human nature in line with the latest scientific evidence.
So why did you write this? I mean, why
I
it's a big topic.
I kind of agree and disagree depending on sort of what level you look at it from.
to sort of
Yeah.
approach. What brought you
I
to
mean, it's
it?
a hopelessly hubristic book, right?
That's good.
I
My thing is even much more hubristic, so I'm all for hubris. That's another issue, sort of in line with what he says, is that people are always so concerned about being realistic that they never actually even dare mention anything bold. They never even dare try to do anything bold.
think that everything starts with our view of human nature, right? Every political philosophy starts with it. And then if we look at the greatest challenges that lie ahead of us as a species, and maybe especially climate change,
But of course,
how
I actually see where I kind of differ, where I diverge from those things, is that I actually intend to change human nature. See, so I recognize that there's lots of bad stuff, and I want to change it through genetic engineering.
how are we ever going to do anything about it if we don't believe in ourselves? If we believe that people deep down are just selfish, then it's never going to work out. So also, if we just want to survive and live sustainably on this planet, I think we need to start with just looking at ourselves in a different way.
Do you, I mean, also enjoy throwing the odd hand grenade? I mean, when I think about that sort of session in Davos, I watched a little
Yeah,
bit of it again
or Tucker.
this morning.
I think that's a good idea.
You went into this elite playground and sort of, you know, basically sort of stuck two fingers
Yeah.
up at them all. Was that the plan?
Yes, that was very much the plan. Well, actually, it was. I knew that on that Friday, this all happened on Friday, the last day of the conference, that I was going to do a panel that was televised and where I had the opportunity to plug my book and try and sell more copies, right? And then the day before that, I was in my hotel room and Skyping with my wife and saying how horrible I found the whole experience of being at the World Economic Forum. You know, it's not really a network or anything. And so I spent a lot of time actually in the hotel room itself, I must admit. But I said, you know what, I just have to do this speech tomorrow or this panel and then I'll go home. And she said, but come on, are you really going to do that? Come on, you got to say what you really think about the whole thing. And then I said, okay, maybe you're right. So I prepared this short speech about, you know, how this is a firefighters conference where no one's allowed to talk about water, right? No one's really talking about taxes, you know, what we actually got to talk about. And that didn't do much. But then over the weekend, or I think on Monday, it totally exploded on the internet. So that was a strange experience. But I think it sort of also reveals the paradox of this book. It is that even though human beings have evolved to be friendly, sometimes that's exactly the problem, right? Very often progress comes from people who are willing to be unfriendly and go against the status quo.
Well, like often, I mean, there he's saying be friendly as in non-confrontational, and so I think it's important to be confrontational when that's required.
To be nasty and just say what they think, right? That often helps us. And if you go to Davos and you expect some kind of conspiracy and these elites, you know, sort of scheming to take over the world, you'll be disappointed, but because you'll discover that actually these elites are really nice and you'll have nice conversations with them.
This is where like these sort of communist people, you know, get it wrong. They have this idea that the elites are all these really evil people that are scheming, and then everybody else is just these poor, innocent people that are suffering from that. And it's not at all. I prefer like the Orwell Animal Farm vision, where everybody is a potential oppressor. That is the actual truth. Poor people would oppress other poor people if they were rich. Like that's how it works.
And that's especially I mean, that is worrying, right? It is.
And
they mean well, and still they don't pay taxes. So someone has to tell them the truth, I guess.
Let me just talk to you briefly about universal basic income as well, and see how you think that argument has shifted. Because when you were talking about it, and you've got a famous TED talk, it's had a lot of views, talking about it, it's still something that people were basically writing off, saying, yes, it's sort of, even people that were thinking, well, it's quite a nice idea in theory, it's quite simple, I like its simplicity, but it would cost too much, and it's just kind of crazy. We're now in a situation in Britain, for example, where the state or the taxpayer is effectively paying for half the country, or taking on that liability at the moment because of the furlough scheme, in which 80% of people's salaries are being paid for in millions of jobs, and also the public sector. It is in a way a universal basic income. They've capped it at £2,500 a month. So do you think this is now an argument that's kind of come of age? And do you think that that is effectively what they're doing, or are they not doing the universal basic income and doing something much more complicated because they don't want to admit that they were wrong?
Well, you have to look at the whole basic income discussion and see it on a spectrum, right? So you can make the current welfare system more basic income-ish, right? You can make it you can remove some conditions, you can make it more universal, right? You can make it more in the spirit of a basic income. So if we'll ever have a basic income, then I think that's how we'll get it. Just, a lot of small steps that will get us there.
But do you still think a universal basic income is the way to do it? Or do you think these more complex instruments that are sort of just coming up out of crises effectively do the same thing, and that's fine?
I think that after the crisis, what I would want is not only like high quality public health care, and I think another essential ingredient is high quality public education. but also a floor in the income distribution. That is really what a basic income is about. It's not a net, but it's a floor, something that you
Yeah.
can always rely on,
Yeah.
right? It's just a right that you have as a citizen.
Yeah.
Venture capital for the people, so that everyone can decide for themselves, whether they want to start a new job or create something new. That's sort of what I envision as the ultimate goal of what I just see as social democracy.
And should that floor be at a comfortable level, or should it be at a difficult level? Because how do you stop people just saying, okay, I'll
Somewhere in
just live
between.
off
So
basic
it should
income?
be enough to pay for your basic needs: food, shelter, education, bit of clothing. But almost everyone would also want to have additional income on top of that. The reason actually, or one of the reasons why I started working on humankind, was that I realized that the idea of a basic income presupposes a different view of human nature. It presupposes that people can actually be intrinsically motivated. They don't always only work because someone else says they have to do it. Or
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you can admit that you might actually need money to be motivated to work, because it's not saying that you don't get extra money from basic income. So I mean, I recognize that like lots of people still. I mean, obviously, some people are going to be intrinsically motivated, but some people aren't. And so, like, basic income doesn't actually do away with this idea that people need a monetary motivation.
because of the money or whatever, but because they have their own dreams and ambitions. So yeah, I think that if you really want to believe in basic income, then you also have to need this different view of human nature.
I always sort of end the podcast by asking people if they could change the world one way by waving a magic
Oh
wand,
God, that's such a
how
hard
they would
question.
do it.
The thing that moved me the most while I was researching this book was at one point I had the privilege of visiting a school in the south of the Netherlands that had sort of completely reimagined what a school can be like. So no more homework, no more sort of rooms, no more sort of strict schedules or curricula,
No more rooms.
no more
What?
tests, no more grades. Just relying on the intrinsic motivation of the kids, and then mixing it all
Uh,
together. All the ages
That sounds
together.
good, because actually,
Or
I actually kind of like that, because in any case, for me, education is just about making you a more well-rounded person. Like nowadays, unfortunately, the focus of education is to get you to be performant in the economy. It has nothing to do with actually like just helping you out be a better person who's just more with it. And I think if that is our goal, then it could actually be plenty okay to not have grades.
the levels, academic levels together. And what touched me the most while I was there is that there was no bullying going on. They
Ah,
designed it in a very different way, and that made me realize actually, and there's a lot of sociology to back this up, that the way we've designed schools now,
generally
especially sort
split.
of the typical strict, maybe let's say the typical British boarding school where the kids of Lord of the Flies went to, these
Uh-huh.
are designed to bring out the worst in us from a very early age, designed to bring out more competition and nastiness. If I could change the world, I would start there, with just creating different environments for our kids, because then you'll have very different individuals who want different things from life.
Now, I like the idea of that, but like if you actually look at maybe some of these sort of alternative schools that aim to be like that in practice, what you see is that like often the kids do unfortunately have less skills in actual like learn like things like writing and so forth, and math and whatever, and the things that are just basic skills that are actually important, and and also sometimes there is actually um a bit of weirdness to it, and so like it just, I mean, I've looked into these sort of Steiner, Montessori, whatnot schools. For instance, this seems different, but those schools, there's often, it is a bit kind of cultish, also. But that's also related to this sort of the ideology that goes with it, the type of people who might send their kids there, and all that. But yeah, I think there's a risk that it might not be as great as you'd actually envision it, and like that was one example. I'm not sure that it would always work out like that. And so yeah, yeah. I think it's important. One thing that is important is like to develop things like to not just be kind of goody goody and let kind of kids just sort of do the things like they want, and not also make them do things according to a very strict sort of um, strict pre-outlined thing, like um, so look, it's a pretty complex subject. In any case, I'm not like I haven't studied like what the best education thing is, but I definitely think it's something that's pretty important, and of course it should be public education up to high school. I believe should be fully paid for by taxes, and should be good education, and and it should be something pleasant. It should be something fun, but not just so much fun that you just don't learn anything. Um, I mean, those are platitudes, of course, what I'm saying here, but I think most people would still agree with me. And so, I mean, there are already some obvious steps that need to be done. I mean, just already enable education in places where that isn't the case.
Yeah, indeed.
That's a whole podcast there. We could do another one on. Rutger Bregman, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ways to change the world and talking to us about humankind, a hopeful history. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating and a review. This podcast.
Okay. Okay, that is it.